The thrilling story begins in the year 1780, where we are shown a junior police officer named George in a village. George had just joined his duty and was performing all his assigned tasks quite efficiently. But one day, George discovers a dead body floating in the water. Alarmed, he immediately goes to the judges who were responsible for making legal decisions in the court. George tells the judges that he suspects someone might have murdered the man and thrown his body into the water. However, one of the main judges suggests that the man might have simply drowned. This was a time when judges used to make one-sided decisions, not based on evidence, but on their personal judgment and will. But George stands against all the judges and insists that times have changed. He says they cannot make a decision until they have proof and confirmation of whether it was a murder. The judges become furious that a mere constable is speaking to them this way. As a result, to shut the case down, they transfer George to a haunted village. In this village, George is assigned to solve a very old case that no one has been able to solve till date. George, being committed to his duty, accepts the transfer without objection and soon arrives in the haunted village. He begins interacting with the villagers and learns that recently, an entire family was brutally murdered there. But no one knows who committed the crime. George visits a wealthy family in the village to investigate further. This family includes a woman named Mary, her husband, and their daughter Catherine. Some other relatives, driven by greed for money, are also associated with the family. George gathers them and asks if they suspect anyone of committing the murders. The family members reply that they don't suspect anyone in particular. They are certain that it was the work of the headless ghost. They describe it as an evil spirit that rides a horse and appears with a severed head. They begin telling George about a large battle that took place years ago, involving German forces. Among them was a man who was extremely powerful, with teeth and a face resembling a demon. He killed many people and decapitated them. Eventually, the people united against him and managed to kill him by beheading him. They buried his body far away, in a place that was. It was a place where no human ever dared to go. And now, after so many years, it seems that he, the headless man, has returned. Despite having his head completely severed, he rides a horse and kills our villagers. When George was told all this, he didn't believe it at first, as he relied on scientific reasoning. But somewhere deep inside, even George's hands started trembling after hearing these terrifying accounts. The family members, concerned for George's safety, gave him a Bible, believing it would protect him from the evil spirit. When George opened the first page of the Bible, he saw a detailed family tree with information about every member. At that moment, it was revealed that the same demonic spirit had brutally murdered another man in the village. This horrific event was known by all the villagers. The murdered man had a son, who was now left orphaned. When George found out about this, he went to the boy and told him not to worry. He asked for the boy's help in his investigation and promised to give him a place to stay. Among the 4 main family members was also a magistrate. George approached the magistrate and said, "So far, 4 murders have taken place." But the magistrate corrected him, saying, "Not 4, 5 murders have happened here." He explained that one of the murdered women had been pregnant, and it was believed that the evil spirit had taken the child from her womb. These revelations began to seem increasingly horrifying to George. But he had no intention of stopping his investigation. Late at night, George entered the house. Not far from him, he saw Catherine. Earlier, Mary and her family had given George permission to stay in their house during his investigation, so he was now residing there. Gradually, Catherine began talking to George. She revealed, "Mary is not my real mother. My real mother became very ill a few years ago, and back then, Mary used to be her nurse. After my mother passed away, Mary married my father. And that's how our family continued." But George couldn't understand why Catherine was telling him all this. Curious, he began asking more about her background and the village. Catherine then began sharing more about the recent murders that had taken place. Many of our own relatives were also killed in those incidents. When my dad and I first came to this village, we were extremely poor. We were only given a small house to live in. But my father worked hard and, on his own, built a huge empire. Now, he has become the leader of the entire village. Before leaving, Catherine gave George a small book that had belonged to her mother. It was actually a book of dark magic, which might be useful to George in his investigation. Without giving it much thought, George kept the book with him. Next, we see those same relatives having a heated argument. In the middle of it, the magistrate, overwhelmed with anger, storms out and begins to leave the village with all his belongings. He no longer wants to stay in the village. George, seeing him on the way, stops and asks why he is leaving the village. The magistrate replies that his life is in great danger. He explains that the same demonic spirit who killed the widow had come to him some time ago seeking help. She had been pregnant and was seeking justice. George then asks who the father of her child was. But just as the magistrate is about to reveal the man's name, the headless horseman emerges from the forest, riding his horse. Without a moment's hesitation, he uses his sharp sword to behead the magistrate. For the first time, George sees the very spirit he had only heard about all these days. The moment he sees it, George faints from shock. Hours later, he opens his eyes while lying on a bed. Now George is convinced that the villagers were not lying. This headless demonic spirit truly exists. Determined, George decides he must visit the very place where the German man's body had been buried, because the evil spirit is his, and it originated from there. Anyone else in George's place would have quit the case and run far away, but George had a deep interest in mysterious cases. So he resolved that no matter what, he would solve this problem. After the recent incident, George also began to believe that all the murders were somehow connected. That's why he called upon the recently orphaned boy, Ben, the son of the murdered man, to help him in the investigation. Together, George and Ben ride on horseback deep into a remote forest. As they travel further into the dense woods, they reach a cave. Inside this cave lived a dark witch. Although George was deeply afraid of witches. But even though George was afraid, he used Ben as a shield and moved forward. Standing before the witch, George said, "Please help us and tell us where the German soldier's dead body is buried." The witch appeared extremely dangerous. Her face was covered with a cloth. After thinking for a while, she decided to help George find the German soldier's body. Using her dark powers, she created a connection to the gates of the underworld. Through that connection, she was able to learn the location of the soldier's burial. The witch then spoke to George in a terrifying tone, "Keep heading west, and eventually, you'll find a dried-up tree that looks especially sinister. The German soldier's body is buried right beneath that tree. His soul has been set free and is now killing people one after another." Now that George had the information he needed, he set out with Ben toward the west. Along the way, they unexpectedly met Catherine, who begged George to let her join the mission. After having come so far, George had no other option but to let her come along. So, Catherine joined their team and the three of them continued toward the west. After traveling for several hours, they finally reached the dry, eerie-looking tree. Beneath it lay an old sword. They began digging, and eventually, George uncovered a human skeleton. However, the skeleton had no head. This confirmed George's suspicion. It had to be the body of the German soldier, since the demonic spirit attacking the villagers was also headless. Looking at the remains, George formed a new theory. He began to believe that this place functioned like a gateway to hell, through which the dead soldier's spirit had escaped. Now they needed to find the missing head, as it might contain clues about the origin of the spirit. But the real mystery still remained. Why was this spirit killing people in the village? What was the reason behind this spree of murders? As George climbed the large tree to investigate further, a portal suddenly opened. From within it, the headless spirit of the German soldier emerged, riding his horse and heading straight toward the village to claim more lives. George, without hesitation, mounted his own horse and began chasing the spirit, because he knew that if it reached the village, someone else would surely die. But by the time George arrived, the soldier's spirit had already wiped out an entire family. George and Ben used all the weapons they had to try and stop the spirit of the German soldier. They fought fiercely and managed to inflict some serious damage to the demonic entity. But the spirit, having risen from hell, was incredibly powerful. Using the very same weapons they had brought, it killed Ben and gravely injured George, leaving him unconscious. Some time later, George opened his eyes, and what he saw left him completely shocked. Suddenly, many of his lingering doubts started to make sense. He realized that the spirit of the German soldier was constantly searching for its missing head, and whoever possessed that head was the one controlling the spirit, commanding it to kill the villagers. But the biggest mystery remained: who had the head, and why were they making the spirit kill people? A few days later, once George recovered from his injuries, he resumed his investigation. He revisited the Bible that the family members had given him. At the very beginning of the Bible was a family tree, listing every member of that noble family. As George examined the tree, he noticed the name of a man who was once the wealthiest person in the village. But both he and his son had recently been killed by the same demonic German soldier. That's when George realized something crucial: every person listed in that family tree was somehow related to the wealthy man, and the spirit had been systematically targeting and killing them. To learn more, George sought out someone who might have deeper insight, someone who could tell them more about the rich man. Along with Ben, before his death, in this flashback, George approached a man who turned out to be a lawyer. When George asked about the wealthy man, the lawyer revealed a hidden truth: the rich man had secretly married the widow. No one in the village knew about the marriage. And the child that the widow was pregnant with? It was the rich man's child. Before his death, The man had legally transferred all his wealth and property to that unborn child. So, years later, when the child grew up, the entire inheritance was passed down to him. Now George finally understood, anyone related to the wealthy man, or anyone who knew the truth about him and the widow, was being hunted down and eliminated by the spirit of the German soldier. Someone, somewhere, had found a way to control the spirit using the soldier's head, and they were using it to wipe out every trace of that legacy. After examining the family tree, George discovers a shocking truth. Years ago, when the widow was pregnant, the child she was carrying was none other than Catherine's father. The entire estate had been transferred in his name, which explained how he had become so wealthy in such a short time. Naturally, George's suspicions now point directly toward Catherine's father. Wanting to dig deeper, George returns home. But to his surprise, Catherine is already there, quietly waiting in his room. When George questions her, she avoids answering and shyly leaves the room. This makes George even more suspicious. As he looks around the room, he notices strange symbols drawn on the floor, symbols that look like they're from some kind of ritual. George starts suspecting that Catherine herself might be involved in all of this. We are then shown Catherine's stepmother, Mary, who is walking deep into a dark forest. Unbeknownst to her, George and Ben have been following her, watching her closely. As George reaches the location where Mary has stopped, he witnesses something shocking. Mary is with another man, and the two are clearly involved in an illicit relationship. But things soon take a darker turn. Mary cuts her own hand with a knife and begins some kind of unknown blood ritual right there in the forest. Mary eventually spots George and, back at the house, threatens him, demanding that he stay silent about what he saw, or face the consequences. Now George finds himself in a dilemma. He's unsure how to tell Catherine's father about what's going on, and when he gets back home, he makes another startling discovery. All the evidence he had collected, which could have proven Catherine's father's involvement, has gone missing. In reality, Catherine herself had taken the evidence. She had found out that George was gathering proof against her father, and in order to protect him, she took all the documents and burned them outside. Catherine didn't want any harm to come to her father, and she also didn't want to lose George, since she had secretly started falling in love with him. But once she realized that George was trying to expose her father, Catherine became furious and stormed off, disappearing into the distance. Soon after, Catherine's father arrived, but George could say nothing to him. He had no evidence left. Catherine's father, frustrated and shaken, started shouting that the lawyer, the very one who had drafted all the wills, had taken his own life, and now he himself was being blamed for everything. This was the reason why Catherine's father had called everyone to the church that very night, intending to reveal the truth in front of all the villagers. Soon, the entire village gathered inside the church. Following the priest's instructions, Catherine's father approached his second wife, Mary, who was sitting there enjoying herself. But not long after, the terrifying spirit of the German soldier appeared from the forest. It immediately captured Mary and held her captive. Then, the spirit started advancing toward Catherine and her father, intent on killing them. However, Catherine's father acted quickly. He took his daughter and the rest of the people inside the church, knowing the spirit could not enter the church. The ghost, no matter how powerful, was unable to cross the church's threshold, and so it went away, waiting for an opportunity. As long as everyone stayed inside the church, they were safe. All the villagers were inside, confused about how to fight such a demon. At this moment, one of the four relatives, a doctor, approached Catherine's father to reveal some important information. But another relative, determined to keep the truth hidden, killed the doctor before he could speak. Seeing this, Catherine's father drew his gun and shot the attacker dead. But the chaos didn't end there. Suddenly, a sharp weapon thrown by the German soldier's spirit struck Catherine's father, pulling him outside, where he was killed. This meant that Catherine's father and all those relatives who knew the truth about the widow were now dead. George was now even more confused. He had thought that Catherine's father controlled the German soldier's spirit, but now, the spirit had killed Catherine's father himself. So, George's suspicion was proven wrong. When Catherine saw her father dead, she fainted, overcome with grief and love for him. George carried her to her room and noticed a pink mark on her hand, the same mark that had mysteriously appeared on the floor of George's room as strange symbols. This seemed like some kind of ritual that Catherine was performing. That made George even more suspicious. He thought maybe Catherine was behind all this because after her mother's death, she had probably learned everything from the book her mother used, which involved dark magic. George suspected that Catherine was trying to use the spirit of the German soldier to take revenge on everyone responsible for her mother's death. But George also knew that if he told the villagers about this, they would turn against Catherine and might even kill her. Since George loved Catherine, he did not want any harm to come to her. So he decided that the best thing to do was to leave the village forever, as revealing all the secrets could put Catherine's life in danger. George started heading out of the village. But just then, he remembered the book Catherine had given him, the very book her mother used to perform black magic. George examined the book carefully and soon recognized the same symbols Catherine had drawn in his room. After reading further, George realized these were not satanic or evil rituals. Instead, these symbols were used to protect people from evil spirits. Catherine had drawn those symbols in George's room to keep him safe. Similarly, the church had the same kind of symbols, which is why the German soldier's spirit could not enter the church. This made George realize Catherine was not the evil person he had thought she was. He immediately returned to the village to continue his investigation. At that moment, Mary, Catherine's stepmother, appeared and knocked Catherine unconscious, taking her away. So it wasn't Catherine who was the true culprit but Mary. Mary took Catherine to a remote, deserted place where she was probably conducting some ritual. After some time, Catherine regained consciousness and was shocked to see Mary in her true form. Mary then revealed the real truth to Catherine, why she was doing all this. Mary explained that many years ago, she was one of the most respected people in the village and lived a good life. The rich man they had heard about earlier was the employer of Mary's father. When Catherine's father and his family moved to the village, the rich man wanted to start a business with them, which led to Mary's father losing his job. Unable to bear the humiliation and loss, Mary's father took his own life. After that, the rich man seized all of Mary's family's property and left Mary and her younger sister stranded deep in the forest. Since then, Mary had decided to kill the rich man and everyone related to him. Her main target was Catherine's family because Mary's family had lived there for years, but Catherine's family had taken control of their land and property. That's why when Mary grew up, she joined Catherine's family and murdered Catherine's mother. So, Catherine's mother was not killed by illness but was actually murdered by Mary. Then Mary attracted Catherine's father and married him so that after killing him too, she could become the real owner of all the property. Now about the German soldier's spirit. Many years ago, Mary and her sister had found the wounded German soldier deep inside the forest, near death. Mary, having already learned black magic from her mother, performed dark magic on the German soldier to take revenge on everyone. She made a pact with the spirit, took its head, and kept it with her to control the spirit of the German soldier. Now Mary finally used that head to summon the German soldier's spirit to kill Catherine. The spirit came, but George had solved the mystery by then and arrived to save Catherine. George was carrying Catherine and running away while the spirit chased them. The spirit caused chaos and caught Catherine, intending to kill her. George fought fiercely with Mary, damaging her and managing to reach the soldier's head. He threw the head back to the soldier's body. The terrifying spirit reattached its head and became fully free, no longer obeying anyone. The spirit then took Mary away, dragging her soul to hell as punishment for all the lives she had taken. George had solved everything with great difficulty. After that, George took Catherine to the city because she had no relatives left in the village. They both started living peacefully. And with that, our adventurous story ends here.